Yeah, thank you so very much for introducing me, and thank you everyone for joining us today for this panel discussion on collaboration and threat intelligence sharing. As my colleague mentioned, oh please, I like the right side. As you know, my introducer mentioned, the Atlantic Council has done great work on disinformation. We also have the Ukrainian Europe Initiative, which has been very active in covering Ukraine in terms of reforms and its process. So it's my pleasure to welcome my panelists here today. Matt Chesson, who is the Foreign Service Science, Technology, and Foreign Policy Fellow for George Washington University. I also have Torsten Wiedemeyer, who's the Regional Director for Anomaly, a threat intelligence analysis platform, and Ivan Petukov, who's a co-founder of Adamant. And then we have Michael Owens, who just recently has a new title. Do you mind sharing that with us?
Sure. My name is Michael Owens, and as of just a couple of days ago, I am now the president of the U.S. Global Center for Cyber Policy.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. I think we should just go ahead and kick it off, and I'll pass it again to Michael Owens to talk about what is the threat, and why is information sharing important?
Sure. So first of all, I'd like to thank everyone for being here today, and it's looking forward to already the great comments we've had, the remarks, and I'll try not to kind of step on some things that's already have been said. But when we talk about threats as a whole, we're really talking about the threat landscape and kind of how that's shifted and changed. And the surprising thing about it is a lot of the things that make these threats more vulnerable, more popular today is the converse of that, of things that we actually like to have. So give an example is around the interoperabilities that we have now, right? I mean, there's a real push to have everything work with each other. That opens up more threats that are out there. The need and demand for always on demand, having cell phones, right? The more things we talk about, the ambassador talked earlier about 3.7 billion people right now being online. We're quickly approaching 50 billion devices, right, including IoTs and other things. So with every additional device we have online, with every additional convenience that we have, we just open up more vectors for threats, right? We make ourselves more vulnerable as a whole. Things that we have around not just IoT, but plug and play, right? Everyone wants devices that they can just connect to the internet and it works, right? Zero configuration or very low configuration is what people generally are liking to see now. And then in corporate spaces, we have bring your own devices. A lot of people talk about that, right? Well, bring your own devices adds more threats, right? More vectors that are out there. And then I think lastly, just automation in itself, right? A lot of times we want automation now, and we can easily configure devices. We can push out devices. We can build new servers on the fly. We can do all these things. But every single one of these things is added to the threat vectors that we have out there, and has made ourselves a little more vulnerable. So when it comes to threat intelligence and sharing and the collaboration around it, it's really based around three things when we're looking at what we can do. Obviously, we know that what we found is that sharing information about these threats and attacks does a few things, right? It allows us to respond much faster. As an organization or as a government or as a smaller or medium-sized company, by sharing these threats allows us to react faster. It allows us to share in the cost of what those threats are. We're able to get more detailed and defined information. We have one challenge that there is a lack of experts out there in the field, right, that truly understand all these threats. So the idea of being able to share that capacity and understanding and expertise, I think, helps us all as well. The idea around collaboration and sharing, though, is really based around three things, and that is who do we share with, right? So who are the people that we share this threat intelligence information with? How do we share it? When we're dealing with different types of companies, different industries, and lastly is let's see, sure, right. Who do we share it with? What information do we share? Right? There's always privacy issues and things around PII, personal information, and then the last thing would be who do we share it with? Right? So those are kind of the three questions we'd have to ask ourselves when it comes to threat intelligence sharing and collaboration.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much, Michael. You mentioned that there are 3.7 billion people that are online right now. And Matt, your work focuses a lot on AI. There are more than just 3.7 billion people. Now we also have the added challenge of AI. Could you talk a little bit more about that threat and what it presents now?
Sure. So I just want to give out a caveat first. I am with the State Department, but these are all my personal opinions. I'm wearing my academic hat today. But when we talk about artificial intelligence, really you have to back up and talk about computational propaganda. Computational propaganda is the use of tools like social media, autonomous agents like bots, big data, basically to spread disinformation, persuade, and manipulate people online. When you look at some of the emerging artificial intelligence technologies that are coming over the next several years, they're radically going to enhance the capabilities of computational propaganda. You're looking at AI chatbots that can talk like human beings and are almost indistinguishable from human beings. Those chatbots are going to have dynamic content creation capabilities. They're going to have affective computing tools that can sense human emotions and accurately portray emotions in order to influence people. They're going to have debating tools that basically can go in and look at a body of information and figure out the pro and con arguments. Those systems are going to be plugged into psychometric profiling systems that use machine learning to figure out from all the data points that everybody has out there with data brokers and on social media, they're going to figure out what your personality is, what your vulnerabilities are, and then approach you with messaging that's custom tailored to your particular political frame. And so when you extrapolate these technologies out, you're looking at potentially millions of propaganda bots running around all over on the web, talking to people, persuading them, selling them things, manipulating them. And these are machine learning tools. So they get better and better over time. They can learn what works and what doesn't work. And so we're looking at a potential future if we don't develop systems to counter these things, where you may actually have machines overwhelming human speech online. These machines are going to be persuading people, but the machines aren't going to be able to distinguish between the human accounts and the machine accounts. So the machines will be trying to influence people and other machines. They'll talk to each other, and the internet may be overrun with machine-driven speech. So we need to really look at that and look at if we don't develop countermeasures and ways to deal with these emerging threats, then where is the space for democratic speech? And where is the space for us to actually have human-to-human interactions online that are trustworthy?
Thank you so much, Matt. And, oh, thank you. Yes, please, thank you. When we're talking about the, bots, I want to take it to Ivan, who really wants to talk about perhaps the Ukraine election in 2014 and the role that bots played in that election. Could you just let us know a little bit more about what your organization does and how this... Yes, please.
Thank you. Speaking about my organization, about my company, Adaman Group of Companies, we have been working for governmental authorities for a long while, since late 90s. And of course, all those early issues related to cyber attacks, to DDoS attacks, before the war started and after the war started, we split all this time before 2014 and after 2014. Before 2014, those were mostly issues about wrong identification of attacks. For example, the server is down and everybody says probably this was a DDoS attack, but actually it was just lots of users actively accessing the server. Those websites of governmental authorities were quite poorly designed. But after 2014, since 2014, even before intervention started, even before war with Russia started, we already saw first attempts to make serious harm to us using botnets. And there was some sort of funny DDoS, but actually it was just several gigabits or several dozen gigabits in January 2014. Back then we had to defend and protect the network of the General Prosecutor's Office of Ukraine. And you may remember all too well all those revolutionary events we had in late 2013, early 2014. And among those events, one of those was when something was played placed on the website of the General Prosecutor's Office. And it was about compliance with commitments taken before Maidan people. Like there was a law passed by the parliament in March 2014. It was lifted, and one of the commitments there was that information should be placed on the General Prosecutor's Office website. And back then, there was an external attack first. And we have got two networks in Ukraine. There is this internal network, which was developed concurrently with external one. We have a Ukrainian internet traffic exchange point, which maintains good connectivity between all ISPs. Now we have got several of those traffic exchange points, by the way. And we also have this external network. So we have filtered out access from the outside. And after some time, one of the big botnets was identified, and it was in Dnipro, former Dnipropetrovsk city. I'm saying this for our foreign colleagues who don't know that Dnipropetrovsk is now called Dnipro. So in that city of Dnipro, there was a network with several thousand infected PCs, which initiated the SYN flood attack. They started connecting to General Prosecutor's Office website. It was a very simple attack, and it was combated in a very simple way. We had to use a mobile phone to counteract it. I have a slide here, an interesting slide I prepared. This attack was fought with one phone call only. After that phone call, somebody would disconnect the patch cord, and after that we started intellectual cleanup, smart cleanup, and we eliminated that attack. But first we eliminated the patch cord. The next attack was before the presidential elections in May 2014. And we have to say that there was some, so to say, artillery shelling in March or April. There were DDoS attacks, which amounted to dozens, up to hundreds of gigabits, and those traffic amounts previously shown by John, those DDoS attacks against American servers. Now, this is the technology which was tested here in Ukraine, and we have learned our lessons here in Ukraine. We have got our experience how to combat those attacks using botnets, because we were a test bed for those. But with joint efforts, we managed to do it. There was high level of collaboration between public at large, specialized associations, private IT companies, and governmental authorities. And as a result, we managed to combat those attacks. You may also remember that back in 2014, then there was a huge DDoS attack against websites of Russian Gazprom, Kremlin, and so on. So there have been some people who also showed to Russia that they cannot behave with Ukraine in that way. And then this DDoS, so to say, devirtualized, and the communications collector was destroyed on May 9, 2014. On that night, we had some TV debates, and that cable duct was melted, and the temperature was 1500 to 2000 degrees. Somebody used special liquids to create this temperature. So DDoS is not just a computer attack. Sometimes that DDoS is devirtualized and turns into a physical attack. I think there was something just before we opened our summit. Between the right and left side of Dnieper River, one of our trunks underwent a fire, and several dozens of communication cables were destroyed. But again, our experts showed their skills. It was all recovered in hours, just in several hours, because we have already created some redundancy. Nobody even noticed that we had this event the day before yesterday, literally before our summit. So between this real world and virtual world, this war switches here and there, because Ukraine is in this conflict zone, and of course a high level of concentration is needed, concentrated efforts are needed. And I believe my colleague Mr. Kazachenko already said something about that website with so-called Yarosh business card, and I can repeat that there was an attempt to put fake information on the website, to place it in one of the folders in Central Electoral Commission and their server, so that it would say that Yarosh won presidential election, not Poroshenko. And it was published in Russian media, but when it was published in Russian media, everybody in Ukraine already knew the actual result, that Mr. Poroshenko won, and everybody would just make a laugh. So there is this very important topic of interaction between telecom providers, ISPs, and those authorities in charge of security, including cybersecurity and third nodes. Thank you.
No, thank you, Ivan. Thank you, Ivan. I mean, Ukraine does present a very unique case because of it's a proof that more collaboration between private and public and government is needed to fight this war, right? Torsten, I want to take it to you now, and I want you, if you may, talk a little bit more about the intelligence sharing platform that you've started building in Ukraine. Why Ukraine?
So hello everybody. I represent Anomaly, but I don't want to add or run a big anomaly story here, more focused on the topic. So why threat intel sharing? Let's start a little bit. A few years ago, around 2000, we were all happy about having an antivirus. Then we added some firewalls. Later we had some good ideas and said, why not collecting all the log files about activities from the desktops, activities from the servers, from the firewalls, email. And then we realized there's a lot of logs, and we implemented big servers. We bought expensive technology like ArcSight, Splunk, all these names. And now we have all these big informations, and we have some analysts sitting in the companies and trying to make something out of this data. So they see something suspicious, an IP address popping up, and then now they start a manual process about looking at passive DNS, who registered this email this IP address, what's the domain name. They look at virus total, check if something happened with that IP address, and they all do this locally. At the end, they can see, oh, it may be suspicious, it may be dangerous, so they do create a firewall policy. End of the story. Attack stopped, and they're happy. So what's missing here is maybe they should share this information with other organizations. Maybe they should share this with the government. Maybe this government should share the information with other governments. So what we as Anomaly are offering is more automated process about we combine the outside world with all the threats. We get this information from threat intel providers. I don't know if you have heard about companies like CrowdStrike, Flashpoint, some open source providers. All this intelligence data is going to go into our platform. We correlate it, we score it. We give the analyst only what's really relevant. And based on this, they can judge if it's important for them or not. And then what I think is the major step is you can tag this as share with other organizations, share with the government. And that gives other organizations the benefit of if company A was attacked and company B wasn't attacked yet, they can prepare themselves before it's really happening. The problem with the sharing community as of today is it's called sharing is caring, but most of the companies they share, they just consume information, they don't give it back. And we created a very easy platform to get rid of all the privacy stuff and get rid of the problems that we have with data protection. And we just share the basics, and with this information, you can do a lot. And during the lightning speed that I have later on, I will tell more about what I really offer for Ukraine. Just in brief words, we're going to implement something with no cost for Ukraine, and within this platform you can create logical groups like finance institutes, governmental institutes, local economy, and it's going to be hosted in Ukraine without any bypass to any other country except getting data into the platform. That's me.
I want to take it back to this who, how, what of information sharing. sharing information can be scary, especially in today's environment, where you don't know who to trust in terms of alliances between governments, even private companies. So how do you, I'm interested to know more about how do you build the trust to actually share? How do you build safe environments or safe infrastructures? And why should companies or governments invest in this and go in for it?
Sure, thank you. Yeah, I think that the first thing, Deputy Secretary mentioned this earlier today, and I'll quote him somewhere where he said that no government can completely protect themselves solely on their own, right? And that's the same in the private industry as well, right? There's no one company, right, that can keep up. Our last panelist talked about the number of threats and the speed at which it comes out. So the idea that sharing actually enables you to be able to do some of those things and takes advantage of that. But yeah, that's a great question, is who do we share with? So what we've seen, for the most part, like companies or like organizations, have somewhat of a trust, because it's all based around trust, right? Companies do you trust? So, and companies that use the same software or same technology, companies that would be open to the same types of threats. So some of the ones that come in mind is the financial industry, of course, and I can give some examples around these, or healthcare. I think in the financial industry, we've just seen within the last couple of weeks in the United Arab Emirates, UAE, they've got 49 banks that have now kind of gotten together and decided that they're going to share information between them to enhance and do a lot of these things that we've talked about. I think trade associations, right? Universities, the internet started with the universities, so it makes sense that universities would kind of coalesce together around some of the sharing of information. But the bottom line really comes down to who do you feel comfortable with sharing your information with? And Torsten made a good comment too about, to share information truly means I'm going to accept information from you, and then I'm going to turn around and give you information, right? So the idea is that it cannot just be a one-directional type thing. And I'd also say that it exists in multiple different levels as well, because who do we share with? I think the Cyber Threat Alliance, right, has just kind of revamped themselves to where they've kind of all agreed, and there's several forming founders of that, and they're all really high-level IT companies. So, but that's from a product standpoint, right? So they've agreed that they will come together to share information so that they can make their products more resilient and learn from each other. So we've all seen the P-certs and security information that comes out from manufacturers and providers that are nonstop, right? They can continually come. Well, if you can have a collaborative environment where you only get one set of updates maybe, right, or a threat anomaly, then you'd be better off for it. So I think, when we start to look at organizations and who those are, that's really where we look at the who. And I don't view it as it's just going to be a clearinghouse for everyone just to share information with everybody. That would be very tough to do, number one, and I don't think that's very effective. I think you'll get the most effectiveness out of it when you're dealing with either environments or you're dealing with organizations that really have some commonality in the way that they either use the information or that the way their information is pulled together, or the type of industry that they're in.
Thank you. And thank you. And I want to pass it back to Yvonne, because now I kind of want to shift us towards, as you're looking ahead, thinking about the upcoming elections in Germany, Czech Republic, how can Ukraine's experience with bots and how they altered, parts of the election, how does that serve as a lesson for looking ahead? Or can it serve as a lesson looking ahead? And then Matt, if you want to jump in on this, that'd be great.
I would start from saying that every country is specific, and every network of governmental bodies is unique and specific. There are some things to be shared with other countries and received, but if we are talking about Germany or European Union as a whole, it has the problems and peculiarities different from those of Ukraine. If there are common problems, I think that the common methods will be used against these countries, similar to those addressed against us. Let's take as example the power industry, the power grid. In case the same threats have been used in the USA, where the degree of integration and connectivity is higher, these threats will be more dangerous. Another thing which is common is the human factor. I think that the technology is not all. Many things depend on the people who are maintaining, servicing, and controlling the service. After 2014, when we have found an attempt to change the information on so-called transit server and interfere with the information about the elections, we established the mirroring technology, which does not allow for any external influence. All details of these mirroring servers are secret. They are based in many geographical points, and they are supported by different providers. These providers, including our company, have vast experience in supporting these mirrors. And as soon as a DDoS attack starts, we check the time difference between mirrors, and all our counterparts are doing the same. If there is a significant lag, it's the sign of problems or link blockage. And the data are updated on these mirroring servers using encrypted and closed links. The server is also at the backend, very deeply in backend, not to be achieved from the external world. So I think that the practical topics of the kind and lessons to be shared with other countries should be rather discussed at the workshop, and we are open for such kind of discussion.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Ivan. So then I would like to talk, Matt, if you could talk a little bit more about the role of bots in elections. And are there any things that we could be doing to protect ourselves against these attacks?
Okay, we're back. So I think this is really interesting, and I'm really glad to hear that a lot of people are raising the links between sort of technical cybersecurity breaches and what is this emerging field of cognitive security. And so, what is cognitive security? This is where adversaries are using online tools basically to influence public opinion with malice. And so when you look at some of these cybersecurity breaches that have come up, Deputy Secretary Blinken mentioned the hack of the AP Twitter account that wiped off $136 billion of value on equity markets. This was a hack that was designed to have a psychological effect. You look at the hacks of the Democratic National Committee last year during the US election. These were breaches where someone was stealing data, but the motivation behind this was actually to influence people and influence voters. Several people have mentioned the attacks on the electrical grid here. Well, people weren't just trying to deny people electricity. They were actually had a motive to undermine the government, right? And so you're looking at an increasing number of connections between these cybersecurity problems and then these cognitive effects. There's a piece of malware out there called Linux Moose, which is specifically designed to steal social media credentials. And then it goes and uses those credentials to go and fake likes and follows for people. This is exactly the same type of thing that people are using in computational propaganda, using fake accounts and bots, of trying to influence trending topics and trying to spread disinformation online. So, you're seeing these connections, and I think this is one real big takeaway. I would like everybody in the technical cybersecurity community to start thinking about cognitive security and how these two issues are very interrelated. On that topic, though, I think we also need to look at the fact that we do not have systems and strategies in place on cognitive security in the same way that we do for technical cybersecurity. You know, computational propagandists are using a lot of these techniques. They're weaponizing information, they're weaponizing ideas, and they're using these to undermine faith in government. They're using these to undermine trust in media, and they're undermining the belief in truth itself. So everybody needs to ask themselves, who in my country is actually responsible for protecting the public from the malicious effects of foreign weaponized propaganda? If you look at the case of the United States, there is no agency or department that's responsible for protecting the US population from foreign disinformation and propaganda. Now, I'm not talking about a ministry of propaganda or doing counter-messaging on your own population. That's a very bad idea. But there are a lot of things that government can do in this space. Government could be researching how people are influenced online. It could be researching a lot of these emerging tools like artificial intelligence and how that's going to impact the space. It could be tracking bot networks and setting up mechanisms to share information. There's lots of academic organizations and private sector organizations that are tracking these computational propaganda bots, but they're not talking to each other now. There's no information sharing on sort of quantitative data on what actually works in this space. And what are the repercussions if we actually try and shut down some of these bot networks? What's the best way to counter message in some contexts versus inoculate populations in other contexts? So this is a big area where we need to recognize both the threat, develop strategies, but then also develop these information sharing mechanisms to address them. Personally, I think we need something analogous to the international CERT mechanisms, where you're sharing information on malware. We need to be sharing information on bot networks, and allies need to be sharing information on disinformation campaigns when they're launched through those bot networks. We need more research from the academic community on what exactly is happening here. We don't have any clue to what extent these networks and online disinformation is actually impacting people and changing their behavior. We don't know how much these efforts are actually changing people's votes. And that's where the academic community can play a huge role here. Keep in mind also that the academic community actually started the CERT system. That actually came out of Carnegie Mellon University, and they created the CERT system, which then governments adopted. So academia actually, this is a public-private effort. This is not something where government can play the only role here. So I think two real takeaways here that I'd like everybody to think about is think about the connections between traditional technical cybersecurity breaches and the cognitive effects that they're trying to have. But also, we need to look to the cybersecurity information sharing models and how people deal with threats as a community and apply those same lessons to the cognitive security space.
Thank you for that, Matt. Torsten, could you talk about how can threat intelligence help local organizations and government?
Yeah. So I would love to add two private comments before I continue. Because we have the election in Germany upcoming, I don't even know, what is it, September, October, November? And it was difficult to vote for someone where you probably know he's lying. So it's like at least what German politicians like to do. They tell you something and they don't really know, call it lying, okay? And now we have an organization spreading fake informations on top of politicians that are lying to me. So at the end, I don't even know what's going on. You don't know if the information in the press is real. You don't know if it's real what they're telling us. At the end, you vote by surprise. And you can be happy if the voting computer is not manipulated. So at the end, we live in kind of tough times regarding fake news, regarding the technical stuff that we can do against it. And the technical answer would be fake news. Anyway, if it runs through the internet, there must be a host. Okay, that's kind of the easy access. If there's a host, you can analyze the IP address. If there's an IP address, you can follow it. So what we need to do is we need to get a lot of information about all the hosts, and if we have bad hosts spreading fake news, we should try to block that host. So that's an easier approach to try to stop fake news from a technical perspective. What companies should do is you should collect as many informations as you have. You should have threat intel coming in, and then based on this information, you should judge about your next steps. And then my plea is, please share your judges, your thoughts with other companies. Please share this with other countries, because the bad guys, they really work together. So they have a good Q&A. They are targeted. They don't have the time to spread an attack to everywhere. That was 2000, where they sent something out and they were happy that they killed some computers. Nowadays, what they want to do is either money, or they influence on a political way, or they just want to put a sign that, like Anonymous is doing, some hacktivism. And if these attacks are targeted, you can analyze it, and you can say, okay, this is for banks, or this is for the industry, or this is an attack coming from somewhere out of Asia to manipulate steel prices in Germany. All of these stuff that happened in the past. As more information, as many information you have, the better judges, or the better scoring, and the better counter mechanism you can activate. So again, please share and share and share.
Torsten, I do want to pull a little bit. I'm glad that you brought fake news, because that goes into a little bit of our work at the Atlantic Council on disinformation. Because it oftentimes is not one piece of information that is spread out everywhere. It is often targeting our vulnerabilities as democracies, things that are real, and just plugging. It goes back to the psychological. So it's not a one attack fits all in terms of how it goes out. So we can't just shut it down immediately when you see it. So if you could expand on that a little bit. I mean, it is a challenge. And sometimes also sharing the disinformation or sharing the fake news actually helps amplify it. So then how do we manage that balance?
Yeah, so from our perspective, sharing and getting information is like, I try to explain it on the booth with some of the local agencies. So the more information sources you have, the better you can judge. Can we agree to that? So if only the Western countries will say it's bad, it may be bad from their point of view, but it's not really bad. So the more information you have, the better you can judge. Okay? So what you need is all the information, the more you can get, and then you filter that and you correlate these information. Okay? This is to reduce, we call it false positives from a technical perspective, but also to justify the source of your information. You need more information from different sources. Fake news. I don't know if we have more than a brief technical answer on fake news, because if I spread something from my personal Facebook account, and my friend's gonna share it, and they're gonna share it, and it's running around, definitely you can't stop that. But if I always share fake news on Facebook, then I can guarantee Facebook could see that and block my account. But if we don't work together, it's not going to work anyway. So there need to be a cooperation between these typical social networks, the social community, and the telco providers in order to have counter mechanisms. Because if I always do bad things, they should block me. It's an approach that would definitely work, but you need Facebook for bad news on Facebook. And I think, at least in Germany, was a big discussion about can we put them in front of court because they shared fake news on Facebook. So we're actually thinking about that they have to be responsible.
I think the challenges that, face Europe are quite different than the ones that face the United States when it comes to freedom of speech, especially. So if you are constantly sharing fake news, it is not possible in the US for, to block you. it's freedom of speech there. So that's, I think, a challenge. But then it goes back to the who. Who determines what is fake news? So then this goes back to Michael, like, who is responsible for identifying the problems and coming up with solutions? And what incentives do governments and private companies, which are quite different, would have to actually fix the problems?
That's okay. Yeah, that's a great challenge, right? And when we talk about back from a collaboration piece, I think we have to start looking at cybersecurity not as this bold new land, this uncharted regions, right? Someone mentioned earlier about, at the end of the day, all threats have a brain. There's a human behind it, right? So getting into some cognitive aspects. These social engineering aspects, I heard it mentioned once today, but it's hard to have this conversation without talking about social engineering, because that's really changed the threat landscape and how a lot of these attacks have been launched. The old idea of, I'm just going to launch brute force attacks and I'm just going to, just kick in your front door. It's effective, but it's loud and it's messy. But the idea of being able to essentially give you the keys to my house, and allow you to get in and steal whatever you want, and oh, by the way, lock the door on the way out, right, lends us to this idea that, and we know this to be true now, a lot of these attacks, it's not a question of if you've been hacked, it was when, because you probably were and you just don't know it yet. So a lot of this, you really have to kind of change our mind about cyber being this unknown, uncharted territory. And we have processes in place. Many governments and institutions have processes in place as to how they would do investigations around any type of crime, right? So when I was with Ernst & Young, I worked in the cybercrime and forensics division. So the work I did there was in cyber, but it was very much leveraged on past work that had been done around traditional crimes and how that was handled. So if you kind of follow those methodologies, I think Torsten actually said before, right, if you know an IP address, you can track that down, right? There's signatures to a lot of these hacks that we see out there. They're literally called digital fingerprints, right? Because the company who wrote it there's similar type code, and you can follow that and you can understand who that is. So yeah, I would definitely say that we need to, General Admiral Rogers, from the head of the NSA, right? Yeah, dual-hatted with Cybercom as well. And others have basically said, from a cyber landscape, it's no different now than air, land, sea, or space, right? So we have to treat it a lot in the same way. And then finally, I think we have to make this connection between academia, private sector, public sector, and policy, right, legislation. Because I think once we start to combine all of those and they stop being so siloed, then we can get some better understanding around how that collaboration works all the way through. I think right now we still have way too much of a side where academia is doing their research and doing very good research on the very heart of the internet. I mean, going back looking at, this gets a little technical, but going back looking at, the actual structure of Ethernet, right? And can we build true security into the basic protocols that we use, from layer 1 all the way through layer 7. So there's work that's being done over there, but then how that translates, right, into how public sector and private sector can actually utilize that. Well, there's a cost, right, that has to be incurred to bear those things to market, to bring those new ideas and research to market. And then from there, once it gets to the market, we have to find a way through government, through policy and legislation, be able to allow those things to actually happen. So it's a continuum, right? And that it has to be viewed that way. And we have to, again, stop siloing the effort and research and work that everyone's doing to allow true collaboration kind of across the field.
I want to ask about the IP addresses and in terms of attrition, going back to who. How do we know where a threat is coming from, actually? And I'm combining this with the fake news, right? Because now you can just say it's not me, or it's coming from China, or it's coming not from Russia. If you could expand a little bit on that, that'd be great.
Yeah, I think, that's one of the hardest things when it comes to doing what we do, right? It's simply called attribution, right? And we put this in any other kinetic type real world scenario. If country X comes over and their or their bombers drop a bomb on a building, there's little doubt as to who done that, and in converse, what our response would be. But we live in a world in cybersecurity and cybercrime to where, we may be dealing with some code that was written by a state actor in Russia that was sold to North Korea, right? That was then propagated that through proxy servers in Iran, right? So knowing an IP address and having to go back and trace that back, you run to a real problem as to really try to lay that attribution as who that company was or who that entity was it a state actor or a non-state actor? So an IP address is only part of it because you can track that, but you have to understand much more than that. You have to look at, who wrote that, if possible. Like I mentioned before about, does this code look familiar to other code that had been written in the past? You have to look at systems that may have been zombied out, right? If some command and control systems to where it was a computer at your house that actually launched the attack, right? So all those things combined together makes it really hard when we try to determine where these attacks come from, what we can learn from them, because it's a constant learning process. Because as soon as we start to figure it out, right, there's already advanced methodology that kind of takes us a little ahead of that. So I think that kind of goes back to the collaboration piece and the threat intelligence sharing, right? The more information we can share about that, if we know who got hacked where, and we can share that information in as close to real time as possible, then we can start to really get to the forensics part of it. And I don't want to get too much into the digital forensics of it, but that's basically it, right? There's fingerprints and there's methods of kind of tracing those back as to who may have been the actual culprit of whatever cybercrime took place. So
I just want to push back a little bit on what Torsten said about blocking websites that are putting out disinformation. I think that works in some contexts. Coming from the US perspective, where we protect even offensive or inflammatory speech, that sort of thing isn't going to work. And so this may be something where, even in the US context, there are types of speech that are prohibited. False advertising was basically given legal liability because we determined it was a social ill. But I think this, going back to sort of the theme of collaboration, I think this is a problem that can be solved through collaboration. Rather than going and trying to identify, okay, this person's putting out disinformation and blocking them, I think maybe a better strategy would actually be to go and give people a choice, but it's an informed choice in what information they're consuming. So I think Facebook has now put out some tools where they'll actually alert people, hey, this may be actually a fake news article. You can still go and read it, you just have that alert. I think there's a lot of things that technology companies can be doing. You could put alerts built into browsers, just like when you visit a malware site, you get a pop-up that says, hey, this may be a malware site. You could also get something like that says, our artificial intelligence algorithm has basically determined this article may be disinformation. I think we need to think about that, and we need to out-innovate the bad guys who are using these technologies against us. That goes back to the collaboration aspect where we probably need a lot more cooperation. So rather than Facebook having a proprietary tool for their platform, why aren't they sharing the information on fake news that they identify with Twitter and with other companies and all the other social media companies? We need to look at maybe developing new open source mechanisms for reporting on bot activity and these disinformation campaigns. And this takes me back to the need for really treating this like a cybersecurity problem. Just like we track malware as it has this viral spread throughout the internet, and then we take actions to combat it, we probably need to be tracking these pieces of disinformation as they go throughout the internet. But instead of blocking them, probably letting people know what it is so that they can actually be an informed consumer, and we're not actually prohibiting speech.
Thank you, Matt. And we're running a little bit short on time, so I want to slightly wrap it up. Collaboration. It's important, but it's challenging. There's no size fits all in terms of policy because of the complications between what works for Europe and what works for the US in terms of policy. Tech sharing seems to be the first step that we can actually make some headway in. And trust. How do we build trust to actually share, to give and take? If I could have 2 minutes, each of you just go through some of those points that can wrap us up nicely. Torsten?
Yeah, trust. How to build trust. That's a question for a guy representing a technology. it's tough. How can we enable as a vendor an organization to be trusted by another organization? That's I think if you trust someone, the first step you need is to take a little bit of risk, because if not, you never trust anybody. But if you look from a technology perspective, it's a little bit easier, because if you share facts and you think it's suspicious, the other organization can judge if they think it's suspicious too. So we give them the choice. We just say, we think it's suspicious, please check. And we don't say that's bad and we mark it as bad and everyone else has to believe it's bad. It's more like we're pointing our fingers and I'm not sure, I think it's bad. And by the time, I think it's more an alliance that's going to be built, and the overall goal is to fight against the bad boys, whatever they think, they're not the bad boys, but we as the white boys, what is it, blue? Fight against, so forget the colors. These guys, they work together, and if we don't work together, we're definitely going to lose the battle. But the first step is a little bit of risk, and then let's prove.
Please.
Thank you. Today, great words have been said, namely, instead of creating walls, building walls, you have to build bridges. So I would like to start with this one. In order to have a proper level of trust, you should always manifest it and you should keep it and not lose it. And when good communications are created, then trust is maintained. Trust is created and maintained between people. Instead of using proprietary software products, based on the experience of my company and myself, we use open source software. The whole company has been using it, and we don't have those problems mentioned by my colleague Dmitry Shimkin. He said there were some problems. Okay, switch to open source software and we will get rid of those problems. Whatever is open, the same way blockchain works. If you use blockchain technology, it's pretty much difficult, pretty much impossible to falsify, to fake anything. There is just privacy. Everything else is open. Open technology shows you everything. You cannot change the data which should not be changed. On the other hand, if you don't want to show that here you are, then you can keep your privacy. So just bringing together the opportunities provided by privacy and open technologies, you can create good digital future. Thank you.
So in the disinformation space and computational propaganda, cognitive security, this is a very difficult question. How do you trust? How do you trust the information that you are getting is actually true and valid? I don't know that there's any one solution to this. I think it's going to have a lot of different small solutions that all add up together. I'm not a big fan of blocking speech, as I mentioned. I think we need to innovate our way out of this. And this is going to require a partnership between governments, the private sector, and academia to figure out new ways, maybe a blockchain for information. I think Jimmy Wales at Wikipedia is coming up with some really interesting new models for journalism. There's an interesting argument to be made of whether the spread of disinformation is actually killing journalism or whether people's lack of trust in journalism actually facilitates the spread of disinformation. I think those are really interesting things to look at, and the way that we get our information through journalism probably needs to change, and there has to be innovations there. You know, the whole model for journalism was established in sort of the pre-internet age. There's a role for government regulation here. Ideally, industry is going to take on this problem and self-regulate and come up with their own solutions, but I think government needs to help. I think government can also play a facilitating role. You know, I think the environment we're in where there's a lot of distrust of institutions, government being the arbiter of trust is probably not going to be a good solution. I think you have to have more open source methods and solutions A lot of people have talked about we need a truth platform, something that's a collective intelligence tool where you basically have a distributed group of individuals all determining through crowdsourcing what's true and what's not true, and everybody has to show their work and their sources. I think that may be a solution. I think people are talking about those things are sort of on the right track. So not an easy problem, especially in the disinformation space, but absolutely collaboration and sharing information is the key to all of this.
Want to bring us home?
Sure. So I think when it comes to trust or building alliances, when it comes to sharing and collaboration, there's a couple aspects of it. Matt, you mentioned legislation and government having a role in this, and I think that governments can be a facilitator. They can help foster an ecosystem, right, that allows all this information to be shared. I think that when we look at reasons, I look on the converse and I say, well, why would companies or organizations not want to share, right? So I think you have to break down some of those barriers there. I know that in the private sector, some companies are unwilling to share, whether it's because of privacy or foreseen liability, or just some companies view the information they collect as an investment in the amount of money they spent to protect their own organization, and then therefore they use that, or what they feel as a competitive advantage for their company. Right? Every other company in the industry gets hacked and they don't because of the money they've invested in it, and they feel that that's a worthwhile investiture, so why should they just hand that over, right? So part of this has to be because of understanding it's for the greater good, right? And that all of this is, we're better off when we all share this information. The other thing I would say is that when like companies or entities all feel threatened, right, if they can kind of bound together, then they will feel more to trust each other because they know they're all in the same boat. And I'll put it as easy context in along the supply chain. So I always tell organizations, look up and down your supply chain, because any and every company out there can be hacked and will be hacked. They are a target, right? Not necessarily victims, but they're a target. So if you go within the supply chain, trends have already shown that there is a trending for companies that are down the supply chain. Smaller companies are more likely or just as likely to get hacked because they may not have invested the same amount of infrastructure money into the threat intelligence going on. So companies that are all in the same boat together, so you want to look up and down the supply chain and encourage each other. Look, we're all in this together. Let's make sure that we're all sharing the same information, we're collaborating with each other, we're securing our systems, and ultimately we can be better for it. So I think that's the work that the private sector can do, and definitely from a from a government sector, sharing interagencies, right, in between different agencies, as well as looking forward to being able to share with global alliances, pulling multiple countries in to share the same information. So that's what I would leave it with.
Any last points? Please, Torsten.
Yeah, I have to come back to the freedom of speech stuff. So first of all, don't think that we in Germany are against freedom of speech. But there's a big difference, from my point of view, between a fake news and the freedom of speech. So if I don't like something, I have the right to say I don't like it. But if I would say there was a terrorist attack in Germany yesterday and it's not true, I would call it a fake news. And if I would try to influence other people with these news that are wrong, I would delete them, because that's nothing to do with freedom of speech. It is the responsibility of the guy providing the platform to protect other people from believing fake news. That's nothing to do with freedom of speech. I think we have shown with the last fight about a comedian against the Turkish government that we fight for the freedom of speech. But there's a stop. And the stop is as soon as you obviously lie in order to do something different, or you want to achieve something different. And this, I meant this with fake news. So sorry if you get me wrong with the freedom of speech.
Just a slight point of clarification. It's not, freedom of speech is just a gray area for the United States in terms of, tying it to policy. So when we're talking about spreading disinformation and spreading false information, it's not so black and white in terms of how we can address it. And it's something that we can continue discussing. And I think this is where collaboration and sharing is very important to come up with some good solutions for these very difficult times that we're facing. Any last points from our panelists?
Just to touch on that, this morning Deputy Secretary Blinken said exactly that, right? He talked about we need to protect the right of free speech, but at the same time allowing the free flow of information and the integrity of that information. So that is paramount, and I think that's part of the challenge that we all are going to have.
Our panelists will have a workshop afterwards where you can ask questions. Thank you so very much for joining us today, and please join me in giving a hand to our panelists.